the only reason they got into that debt was they saw possibilities of borrowing money and gambling on rising house prices or rising share prices. Now, the days of rising house prices are clearly over. There's a form of bubble taking place in the share market, but even there it hasn't reached back to the levels it was back in 2007. And when you deflate it by inflation, it's nowhere near the level it was back in 2000. So it's a losing game, putting your money into the stock market, even though there's been a short-term rise. There's a bubble in commodities, but even that's something which actually more the big boys get a chance to play with. I'd be horrified to see if a commodity speculative boom began with the American household sector being dragged into taking out contracts to speculate on rising commodity prices forever. Because if you think share markets can fall quickly, watch what happens when commodities start falling. So it's insane to imagine there could be another debt-driven bubble. So therefore you've got to have a period of growth in the American economy which is driven by real changes in GDP, not by increasing levels of debt, and yet at the same time is going to be constrained by people's inability to invest because they have such huge debt servicing levels. Now that's the situation Japan's been in for the last 20 years. And I've really, for a long time, expected this crisis to be a bit like America turning Japanese, to take the old song. And they're turning Japanese by making exactly the same mistakes that they criticised the Japanese for making 20 years ago. And this was they said they should have shut down the zombie banks. This is what the Americans were telling Japanese to do back in 1991-92, saying, shut down your zombie banks. They've lent too much money. They shouldn't have done it. They should be shut down. Eliminate the debt that way and start the whole system over again. Don't try to deficit spend your way out of trouble. Well, the Japanese kept the zombies alive and tried to deficit spend their way out of trouble. What are the Americans doing now? They're keeping the zombies alive. In fact, the zombies run the system. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and friends are dominating what's being done in economic policy in America. They're not being the zombies, they're feeding the zombies. And keeping the debt levels at those high levels while deficit spending. Now, the great irony is they've managed to attenuate the severity of the crisis by that deficit spending, which the Japanese did as well, of course. But unlike the Japanese, there's now a political consensus in America to get the government deficit down again. Now, when they start doing that, that means that the cash flow that the government sector gave that attenuated the decline is going to start being withdrawn. And when that withdrawal happens, rather than having a robust private sector economy, which is what the mainstream neoclassical economists expect, you're going to have a debt-encumbered society where again you'll fall back down again. And that's starting to turn up in the data as well. But it really comes down to the idea of acceleration. So if you look at the level of spending in the economy, and this is where I differ again from neoclassical economists who completely ignore the role of debt in their thinking. But aggregate demand is not just your income, it's your income plus the change in debt. Okay, so that's what enables you to buy the new purchase of commodities, which is largely what GDP is, plus buying existing assets, which is what all the gambling on asset markets is about. So aggregate demand is the sum of GDP plus the change in debt. Now that means that the change in aggregate demand is the change in GDP plus the acceleration of debt. Now, what caused the boom was that acceleration was getting faster and faster, and you had rising levels of change in aggregate demand driven by accelerating levels of debt. Then you hit the wall, and that acceleration turned into a matter of deceleration, and down you plunged. Now, by all the stimulus measures the government's done, and trying to encourage people to borrow money again as well, they've slowed down that rate of decline in debt. Now, ironically, the slowdown in the rate of decline of something is an acceleration. When you look at the credit impulse in America, it's now turned positive. But for that to be maintained at a positive level, just like if you're in a car and you're decelerating less rapidly, so you're not slowing down as much, ultimately to keep on doing that, you're going to accelerate again and start going forward rather than backwards. Well, for that to happen in America, for that pulse from credit to remain positive and push growth further, ultimately debt levels would need to rise again. No, I just simply don't believe it's going to happen. Like you're in a Lamborghini doing 350 kilometers an hour, and you slow down to 260, but then you're slowly starting to move. Your rate of decline is getting slower and slower, and then ultimately you're going to get faster and faster. You're not going to crack 350. You're going to get to a ceiling and slow down once more. So that fluctuation in the credit impulse is what's been happening in Japan for 20 years. And because the Americans are making the same mistake of not abolishing that debt, they'll continue doing the same fluctuation as well. So they'll rise out and fall back down again. It'll be called a double dip, but by the time it's over, it'll be a quadruple dip.
And few today understand the past and present of this nation better than David McCullough. He is one of the world's most decorated historians, having won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his biographies of Harry Truman and John Adams.
I've known, to a greater or lesser degree, I think 7 presidents. My understanding, I think, of what weighs on their minds is pretty close. I don't think I could sleep at night if I knew what they know and had all of that on my shoulders. I don't know how many people could sleep at night.
When you look at it, Mr. McCullough, what makes a great president?
The capacity to move the country to do better than it thinks it can with the use of the English language.
Communication is that important.
The power of the written word, the spoken word, very, very important. An ability to stick to your principles, an ability to work with people with whom you disagree and may dislike. I try to stress that exceptional presidents are the exception. We can't expect every president to be a great president. It doesn't happen that way. Life isn't like that. And you can't predict, there isn't a type. They come in all shapes and sizes. Who would have ever thought that Harry Truman would be one of our greatest presidents? And there's no question he was. He said, I never forgot where I came from, who I was, where I came from, and where I would go back to. Now that's a man who knows exactly who he is. He's not craving this adoration and limelight in order to feel good about himself. He didn't want the job. It was thrust upon him. He did not have the gift of moving the country with words the way FDR did or Lincoln did. And he did not have the physical presence that Washington had. I think Washington is our greatest president.
Why?
He set the standards for behavior, integrity, and patriotism of the best kind, not the flag-waving kind, but true love of country. All of our best presidents, without exception, have had a sense of history, and I don't think that's coincidental. And one of the things that a sense of history gives to a person is not just an appreciation and understanding of what happened before we came along, but the realization that we too are part of history, and we too are going to be judged by history. And that's extremely important, that today's polls, tomorrow's headlines are not going to matter. Yeah. What matters, how will you look, how will this time look in time to come?
But you're optimistic at the end of the day.
Yes, I am. I'm optimistic in the long run, principally because of what I see in the generation of my own children and grandchildren and the students that I meet when I'm lecturing at colleges and universities. I'm distressed, I'm sometimes stunned by how much they don't know about the history of our country. But I know how bright they are, how well-meaning they are, that they want to do the right thing.
Do you think that we have lost some of the optimism and energy that you saw in the 19th century?
Yes, temporarily. I'm a short-range pessimist, a long-range optimist. I think we'll get through these troubles. We've been through worse. When 9/11 happened, people say, oh, this is the worst thing we've ever been through. Yes, it was terrible, but by no means was it the worst we've ever been through. The Revolutionary War, the Civil War, imagine 600,000 people killed. The influenza epidemic, the Great Depression. These were terrible times. I think maybe the darkest time was right after Pearl Harbor. We had no army, half our navy had been destroyed. The Germans were nearly to Moscow. Britain was about finished. And Churchill came across the Atlantic and he gave a speech and he said, we haven't gone this far because we're made of sugar candy. That's the message we need now.
And that's the kind of historical perspective we all need. David McCullough, thank you very much.